the Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never seen such panic. Representatives from hundreds of worlds sat in their floating chairs, their faces showing pure terror. The massive dome-shaped chamber, usually filled with calm diplomatic discussions, now buzzed with frightened whispers and desperate conversations. Ambassador Veltar, of the Zilani species, struggled to stand at the central podium. His tall, graceful form trembled as he tried to speak. The Zilani were known throughout the galaxy for their beautiful blue skin that seemed to glow with inner light. But now, Veltar's skin had turned a sickly gray color, like old metal left in the rain. His voice, which usually sounded like gentle music, now cracked and broke with each word. The holographic displays floating above. Assembly showed scenes that made even the bravest delegates look away. Entire star systems had been turned into graveyards. Once beautiful planets with green forests and blue oceans were now nothing but bare rock and twisted metal. The Vorthok swarm had consumed everything living and turned it into more of their horrible machines. "The mechanical plague moves faster than our fastest ships," Veltar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our scientists have run every calculation, every simulation. Our homeworld has maybe 3 days before the swarm arrives. Every single analysis gives us the same answer: complete extinction of our species." The Vorthok swarm was unlike any enemy the galaxy had ever faced. They were not living beings, but machines that thought as one massive mind. They consumed entire worlds, breaking down everything into raw materials to build more of themselves. They learned from every battle, adapted to every weapon. It grew stronger with each victory. Council Speaker Tharndell, whose octopus-like tentacles usually moved with dignified grace, now writhed with obvious stress. The elderly leader had guided the council through many crises, but nothing like this. "Our combined fleets have thrown everything we have at them," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "The swarm studies our tactics, learns our weaknesses, and becomes immune to our weapons. We have tried energy weapons, kinetic bombardment, even temporal disruption fields. Nothing works for long." The chamber fell into a heavy silence. Representatives from warrior species like the Krillian Empire and the hegemony of Vex sat with their heads bowed. Even the mighty Titan lords, whose ships were the size of small moons, had been crushed by the swarm's relentless advance. It was then that a young aide, barely old enough to serve in the council chambers, spoke up from the back of the room. Her voice was so quiet that the chamber's audio systems had to amplify it for everyone to hear. "What about the humans?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entire chamber seemed to freeze. Some delegates actually gasped in shock. Others began talking rapidly in their native languages, their voices filled with fear and uncertainty. For decades, the humans from the planet they called Earth had been kept separate from the rest of galactic civilization. They had been labeled as Deathworlders, a term used for species that came from planets, so dangerous that they created beings too violent and unpredictable for normal society. The humans had been quarantined, forbidden from joining the galactic community, and their ships were not allowed in civilized space. But now, with the Vorthok swarm threatening to consume everything, that old fear was being replaced by desperate hope. The same qualities that had made the humans too dangerous for polite society might be exactly what was needed to fight an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with, negotiated with, or stopped by conventional means. Admiral Kim Jae-sung pressed his palm against the cold metal of the observation window, watching Earth slowly turn below him. The planet looked so peaceful from up here on Lunar Defense Station. Swirls of white clouds over blue oceans, green, and brown continents drifting by like a slow-motion dance. It was hard to believe that down there, in the government buildings and military headquarters. The most important debate in human history was taking place. 12 hours had passed since the alien message arrived. It's 12 hours since the same beings, who had called humans too dangerous for civilized space, had come begging for help. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the human colonies scattered across the solar system. Captain Park. Minho walked up beside his admiral, carrying a datapad filled with preliminary fleet orders. His face showed the same mixture of anger and disbelief that most humans felt right now. "They called us monsters," he said, his voice bitter. For 30 years, they wouldn't let our ships enter their space. They set up blockades around our system like we were some kind of disease that might spread. Jae-soon remembered those early days when humanity had first reached for the stars. They had been so excited to meet other intelligent life, to join the galactic community. Instead, they had been met with fear and disgust. The aliens had studied human history, the wars, the conflicts, the violence, and decided that humans were too dangerous to be trusted. They treated us like rabid dogs, Minho continued, scrolling through the deployment data. Banned our traders from their markets, refused to share technology, even blocked our communication attempts. They built their whole civilization on the idea that we were savage beasts who would destroy everything we touched. The Admiral nodded slowly. He had lived through those years of isolation. Watching as humanity was forced to develop on its own while the rest of the galaxy enjoyed peace and prosperity. Yet here they are, he said quietly, asking the monsters to save them. But something had changed in the hours since the message arrived. The alien transmission hadn't just contained a request for help, it had included images. Refugees fleeing their dying worlds, families separated as evacuation ships departed overcrowded, children crying as they left the only homes they had ever known. The footage showed the Vorthok swarm's victims, not the proud alien diplomats who had shunned humanity, but ordinary people facing extinction. Those images had spread through human social networks like wildfire. Despite decades of rejection and isolation, humans found themselves feeling something they hadn't expected: compassion. The same species that had been called too violent and emotional was now moved by the suffering of beings who had treated them as outcasts. In the military command centers, veteran officers who had grown up hearing about alien prejudice found themselves arguing for intervention. On colony worlds, civilian leaders who had once resented the galactic quarantine now called for immediate action. The human response wasn't driven by politics or strategy, it was driven by something deeper. The debate in Earth's United Defense Council had been intense but brief. Some argued that humanity owed nothing to species that had rejected them. Others pointed out that this could be humanity's chance to prove they belonged in the galactic community. But in the end, the decision came down to something simpler. It was the right thing to do. The transmission from Earth reached lunar defense, stationed just as the planet's night side rotated into view. The message was short and direct. All defense fleets are authorized to respond to the Galactic Council's request. Humanity will answer the call. Admiral Jae-soon looked out at the stars, knowing that somewhere out there, an enemy that had defeated the galaxy's greatest powers was waiting. Dr. Lee Hijin rubbed her tired eyes and looked at the holographic display one more time. She had been studying the alien military records for 18 straight hours, and what she found made her stomach turn. The Vorthok swarm wasn't just winning battles, it was learning from every single fight, getting smarter and deadlier with each victory. The conference room at Earth Strategic Command Center was packed with the highest-ranking military officers from every human colony. These were people who had spent their entire careers preparing for conflicts that might never come. Faced an enemy that had already proven it could defeat forces far more advanced than anything humanity possessed. The problem isn't their weapons or their numbers, Hijin said, her voice hoarse from hours of briefings. The problem is how everyone else fights them. She gestured to the display showing battle recordings from 17 different star systems. Every single galactic species follows the same basic rules of warfare. They try to win with minimal losses, preserve their fleets for future battles, and always leave themselves an escape route. The recordings showed the same pattern over and over. Alien fleets would engage the swarm, inflict some damage, then retreat when casualties mounted. Each time the swarm would analyze their tactics, adapt its defenses, and become harder to defeat in the next battle. General Choi Dae-hyun, a veteran who had served in conflicts across the outer colonies, leaned forward in his chair. His scarred face showed the confusion that everyone in the room was feeling. "So what are you suggesting, Doctor? That we should fight differently?" Jin took a deep breath before answering. What she was about to propose went against everything the galactic community believed about civilized warfare. "We need to do what they can't bring themselves to do," she said. We need to be willing to sacrifice everything for victory. The swarm learns from enemies who want to survive. It doesn't know how to handle enemies who are willing to die. The room went completely silent. Officers who had been whispering among themselves stopped talking. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed too loud. "You're talking about suicide missions?" said Admiral Yoon Seok-jin, his voice barely. Above a whisper, "I'm talking about total war," Haijin replied. "The kind of warfare that every other species in the galaxy finds too horrible to contemplate. The swarm adapts to survival strategies because that's all it's ever faced. But how do you adapt to an enemy that treats extinction as an acceptable outcome?" The idea was both terrifying and brilliant. For decades, humanity had been called too violent, too aggressive, too willing to fight. The aliens had seen these traits as flaws that made humans unfit for civilized society. But now, those same traits might be exactly what was needed. General Choi stood up and walked to the display, studying the battle recordings with new eyes. "You're saying we weaponize our willingness to die," he said slowly. "Turn our reputation as Deathworlders into our greatest advantage." "Exactly," Haijin nodded. "While other species build ships to bring their crews home safely, we build ships to ensure the enemy never threatens another world. Don't fight to minimize casualties. We fight to maximize results, regardless of the cost." The implications were staggering. It meant designing vessels that were essentially guided missiles piloted by volunteers who knew they would never return home. It meant tactics that would horrify the galactic community. It meant embracing the very qualities that had made humanity outcasts in the first place. Within hours, human shipyards began construction on a new class of vessels. The Reaper-class ships were built around a simple philosophy: maximum damage, minimum survival. They would carry the fight to an enemy that never faced opponents willing to guarantee their own destruction for victory. The transformation began within hours of the final decision. Across human space, from the inner colonies around Earth to the distant mining outposts in the Outer Rim, everything changed overnight. What had been a peaceful civilization focused on exploration and trade suddenly became something the galaxy had never seen before. Species mobilizing for total war. Captain Nam Soo-jin stood in the command center overlooking Luna's industrial district, watching through the massive viewing windows as construction crews worked around the clock. The moon's surface, once dotted with research facilities and civilian manufacturing plants, now looked like a giant assembly line. Massive construction bays stretched across the lunar landscape, each one designed to build the new Reaper-class vessels. The captain had been reassigned from her exploration duties to oversee the conversion of Luna's peaceful infrastructure into military production. It was heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. Factories that had once produced consumer goods for the colonies were now churning out weapons and armor plating. Research labs that had been working on medical advances were now designing more efficient ways to deliver destruction. "Give me the production numbers," she called to her aide, Lieutenant Oh Junwoo, who was monitoring the construction feeds from his workstation. 1,200 Reaper-class vessels within 6 rotations, he reported, his voice filled with amazement at the numbers. "The asteroid belt facilities are working non-stop. We're literally stripping entire planetoids for raw materials. These asteroids have been mining targets for decades now. We're consuming them completely in a matter of days." The scale of the operation was staggering. Human mining ships that had spent years carefully extracting valuable materials from asteroids were now using massive industrial processors to consume entire rocks. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of metal, every rare element, every chunk of ice was being turned into components for the war effort. But the most remarkable thing wasn't the industrial capacity, it was how quickly old enemies had become allies. For centuries, Earth's nations had competed and sometimes fought with each other. The Russians and Americans had been rivals in space exploration. The Koreans and Japanese had their own territorial disputes. The Europeans had their economic conflicts. With the Asian powers, all of that was forgotten now. Russian nuclear specialists were working alongside American engineers to design the most destructive weapons ever created. Korean shipyards were sharing their advanced hull construction techniques with German manufacturers in Chinese rare earth. Processing facilities were coordinating with Australian mining operations to ensure no resource was left unused. Lieutenant DeCilo pulled up another display showing the global production network. "The coordination is incredible," he said. "Former enemies are sharing their most classified military technologies. The Russians are teaching everyone their nuclear weapon designs. The Americans are opening their advanced manufacturing facilities. 2 international teams. It's like the entire species has become one giant military force." The transformation wasn't just about building ships and weapons. Human society itself was changing. Civilian scientists were leaving their research projects to work on military applications. Artists and writers were creating propaganda to maintain morale. Even children in schools were learning about the war effort, collecting scrap metal and doing their part. The galaxy watched this transformation with a mixture of horror and fascination. Other species had mobilized for war before, but never like this. They had never seen an entire civilization willingly sacrifice its peaceful way of life for a cause. The speed and scale of human militarization terrified the aliens, who had once called humans too violent for civilized society. Meanwhile, the Vorthok swarm continued its relentless advance toward the Zalani homeworld. The outer defense platforms were already falling, their elegant energy shields no match for the mechanical tide. Time was running out, and everyone knew it. The question was whether humanity's war machine could awaken fast enough to make a difference. The moment the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace, everything changed. The Kepler 442 system had been quiet for days, the calm before the storm, as the Vorthok swarm prepared for its next advance. Now, 60 human vessels materialized at the system's edge, their dark hulls looking like predators emerging from the deep space void. Admiral Jae-soon stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching. The sensor displays fill with data about their enemy. The Vorthok drones were already moving toward them, strange, geometric shapes that looked more like abstract art than spacecraft. They moved with perfect coordination, like a school of mechanical fish swimming through the darkness of space. "Visual contact with the swarm," reported the sensor officer, his voice tight with tension. "They're unlike anything in our databases. No organic curves, no wasted space. Everything about them is built for efficiency and destruction." The admiral studied the approaching enemy vessels. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, crystalline structures that seemed to shift and change as they moved, reflecting the light of the system's star-like deadly prisms. But there was something wrong about them, something that made human instincts scream in alarm. They moved too perfectly, turned too precisely, operated without any of the small imperfections that marked living crews. Fleet Captain Song Myung, "Begin the engagement," Jae-soon ordered through the fleet communication system. "Remember, we're not here to win this battle. We're here to learn everything we can about how they fight." The words felt strange to say. Every human military tradition emphasized victory, emphasized bringing your people home safely. But this mission was different. They were here to be test subjects, to let the swarm study them while they studied it back. The battle began with a violence that shocked even the hardened human crews. The Vorthok drones opened fire with weapons that seemed to bend the laws of physics, energy beams that curved around obstacles, projectiles that split into multiple warheads mid-flight, defensive fields that turned kinetic energy back against attackers. But the human response was something the swarm had never encountered. Instead of the careful, measured tactics used by other galactic species, the humans fought with an intensity that bordered on madness. When their primary weapons failed, they used their ships as battering rams. When their hulls were breached, they turned their life support systems into improvised weapons. Captain Song Myung's destroyer, heavily damaged and losing atmosphere, made a direct collision course with a swarm vessel 3 times its size. "All hands, abandon ship," she ordered. "But first, let's give them something to remember us by." The destroyer's nuclear reactor went critical at the moment of impact, vaporizing both ships in a flash of atomic fire. The alien observers watching from distant monitoring stations were horrified. The humans were using tactics that violated every rule of civilized warfare. They were turning their own ships into weapons, sacrificing their crews without hesitation, fighting with a desperation that seemed almost insane. But Admiral Jason watched with cold calculation. The swarm was learning, adapting to each human tactic within minutes. Their defensive systems began countering ramming attacks. Their weapons adjusted to human ship designs. Their formation patterns changed to minimize damage from nuclear explosions. "They're fast learners," he murmured to his tactical officer. "But they're learning the wrong lessons." The battle raged for 6 hours. One by one, human ships were destroyed or disabled. The swarm's adaptation was remarkable by the end of the engagement. They had developed countermeasures for every human weapon and tactic, as the last human vessel. In the system prepared for its final act, Admiral Jason smiled grimly. The enemy had learned to counter human weapons and tactics. It studied human technology and found ways to defeat it. But they hadn't learned to understand human sacrifice, the willingness to die for something greater than survival. Final ship detonated its reactor core, taking 3 swarm vessels with it. The lesson was complete. The plan Admiral Jason created was unlike anything ever attempted in the history of galactic warfare. It stretched across 4 star systems, each one becoming a testing ground for humanity's most desperate strategy. The concept was simple enough that any military academy student could understand it. Force the enemy to learn and adapt, then use that adaptation against them. But the execution was so brutal that it would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Captain Yoon-ji stood on the bridge of her flagship, surrounded by what looked like a ragtag collection of cargo ships and industrial vessels. But appearances were deceiving. Each of these civilian craft had been gutted and rebuilt, their cargo holds now packed with enough explosives to level a small city. They were flying bombs piloted by volunteers who knew they would never see home. "Again, all ships begin the gauntlet sequence," she broadcast to her fleet. Her voice was steady, but those who knew her could hear the underlying sadness. "Today, we teach them about human stubbornness." The second wave of the gauntlet strategy began as Jihai's fleet engaged the swarm near the mining colonies of the Procyon system. The battle was chaos from the first moment. Human ships that looked like helpless cargo haulers suddenly revealed hidden weapons and began ramming attacks that caught the swarm off guard. But the enemy learned quickly, adapting their defensive patterns within hours. The third wave came, at the industrial world of Kepler 438b. This time, humans used converted passenger liners filled with automated weapons systems. The swarm adapted again, developing new tactics to counter the human strategy. Each battle taught the enemy something new about human warfare. Their collective consciousness grew more efficient at predicting and countering human moves. Fourth wave was the most brutal yet. In the agricultural system of Gliese 667c, human forces used tactics that made their alien observers physically sick. They turned entire space stations into weapons, using the orbital habitats as massive kinetic projectiles. They converted asteroid mining platforms into guided missiles. They even used their own wounded ships as decoys, drawing swarm vessels into traps. The alien representatives watching from their monitoring stations were horrified. The Zelani ambassador actually fainted when he saw humans deliberately crashing their evacuation ships into enemy formations. The council observers sent urgent messages back to their governments, warning that humanity might be even more dangerous than they had originally thought, but the swarm was learning from every encounter. Their collective consciousness analyzed each human tactic, studied each weapon, and developed countermeasures with frightening speed. By the fourth battle, they could predict human strategies almost before the humans implemented them. Their adaptation was so complete that human losses were becoming catastrophic. "They're getting too good at this," reported Commander Baesungo from the Tactical Analysis Station. "Our casualty rates are climbing with each engagement. The swarm is learning to counter our moves faster than we can develop new ones." Admiral Jason nodded grimly. "That's exactly what we want," he said. "Let them become experts at fighting humans. Let them think they understand us completely." Meanwhile, the Zelani homeworld's outer defenses were crumbling. The elegant energy shields that had protected their civilization for centuries were failing. Under the relentless assault, Evacuation ships filled with refugees streamed away from the dying world, carrying the last remnants of a species that had once been proud and independent. But the human fleet's true purpose was becoming clear too. Those who knew what to look for. They weren't just fighting random battles. They were systematically mapping the swarm's neural networks, studying how their collective consciousness operated across multiple star systems. Each engagement provided more data about the enemies. Central processing nodes, their communication relays, their decision-making hierarchy. The gauntlet strategy was working perfectly. The swarm was adapting exactly as predicted, becoming increasingly efficient at countering human tactics. They were also becoming increasingly dependent on their central consciousness to coordinate these adaptations. And that dependency would soon become their greatest weakness. The darkness of space suddenly erupted with light, as the Vorthok swarm's main force tore through the fabric of hyperspace. What emerged was beyond anything the human fleet had prepared for, a mechanical tide, so vast it seemed to swallow the stars themselves. Thousands upon thousands of geometric nightmares moved in perfect formation, their crystalline hulls reflecting the distant sun like a constellation of death. Admiral Jae-soon stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the sensor displays struggle to count the enemy vessels. The numbers kept climbing: 5,000, 8,000, 12,000 ships. The swarm had committed everything to this final assault, bringing forces that dwarfed anything seen in galactic history. Against this overwhelming tide stood 300 human vessels. 300 ships carrying crews who had volunteered for a mission they knew would be their last. The contrast was staggering. A tiny human fleet facing an enemy that could have conquered entire star systems with ease. All ships, this is Admiral Jae-sung, came the transmission across the fleet communication channels. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of a species' last hope. Execute Order 7. Today we show them what it means to corner the children of Earth. Order 7 was humanity's final protocol, the complete abandonment of all rules of civilized warfare. It meant using every weapon, every tactic, every dirty trick that human ingenuity could devise. It meant fighting with the desperation of a species that had been pushed to the absolute edge. The battle began with a violence that made the previous engagements look like training exercises. Human ships launched nuclear mines that turned entire regions of space into radioactive death zones. Kamikaze drones, piloted by artificial intelligence programs that had been taught to think like suicide bombers, struck with mechanical precision. At the swarm's formation centers, the human fleet used tactics that would have been considered war crimes against any living enemy. They weaponized their own atmosphere, turning life support systems into poison gas dispensers. They overloaded their reactor cores and used the resulting explosions as directed energy weapons. They even used their own escape pods as guided missiles. Packed with explosives and steered by volunteers who knew they would never reach safety, the Vorthok swarm adapted rapidly. Their collective consciousness analyzing each human tactic and developing countermeasures within minutes. But something unexpected was happening. The sheer unpredictability of human desperation was creating chaos in their processing systems. The swarm's intelligence was designed to handle logical, predictable enemies. Humans fighting for survival were neither logical nor predictable. Commander Bae Sun-ho watched from his position at the tactical station as his display filled with red markers. Each red dot represented a human ship that had been destroyed, a crew that would never return home. The numbers climbed steadily: 50 ships lost, 100, 200. The price of this battle was being measured in the lives of heroes, and the bill was staggering. "We're losing them faster than projected," reported the tactical officer, his voice tight with emotion. "At this rate, we'll have no ships left within the hour." But Admiral Jae-soon wasn't watching the casualty reports. He was studying the swarms, behavior patterns, watching how their collective consciousness was struggling to process the chaos of human warfare. The enemy was adapting, but their adaptations were becoming increasingly frantic, increasingly desperate. "They're overloading," he murmured to his aide. "The collective mind is trying to process too many variables at once. They've adapted to our weapons, our tactics, our strategies." but they can't adapt to our willingness to die for something greater than ourselves. Battle raged on, space itself becoming a graveyard of twisted metal and atomic fire. But with each human ship that died, the swarm's collective consciousness grew more confused. More overwhelmed by the sheer illogical nature of human sacrifice, the moment of truth had arrived. The Vorthok swarm's massive fleet was closing in on the Zilani homeworld, their geometric formations moving like a mechanical storm across the star system.
Odds.
On the planet's surface, billions of innocent beings waited for salvation that seemed impossible. The last evacuation ships were already departing, carrying refugees who might be the final survivors of their entire species. Admiral Jae Sung stood alone on his bridge, looking out at the remaining human fleet. Only 47 ships were left. From the original 300, these vessels were battered, their hulls scarred by battle, their crews exhausted from days of continuous fighting. But in their battered state, they carried something that no other species in the galaxy possessed: the willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers. "All ships, prepare for final protocol," the Admiral announced, over the fleet communication system. His voice carried across the void to every human vessel, reaching crews who had already said goodbye to their families back on Earth. Set course. For the swarm's central nodes, "Today we prove that some things are worth dying for." Dum-dum. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. One by one, ship captains acknowledged the order. There were no complaints, no requests for alternative plans, no desperate attempts to find another way. Each crew had volunteered for this mission knowing it would be their last. They had made peace with their fate long before this moment. What happened next would be remembered as the most extraordinary act of sacrifice in galactic history. The entire human fleet turned toward the swarm's central command vessels there, engines burning at maximum power. These weren't military attacks or strategic maneuvers. They were guided missiles piloted by living beings who had chosen to die for a cause greater than themselves. The alien observers watching from their monitoring stations were struck silent. The Zilani refugees on their evacuation ships pressed against the viewing ports, unable to believe what they were seeing. The proud species that had once called humans too violent for civilized society were now witnessing an act of selflessness that defied all logical understanding. From the human ships came something that made the moment even more powerful: singing. Across the fleet communication channels, human voices joined together in old Earth songs. Some sang military anthems from their home nations. Others chose folk songs their grandparents had taught them. A few crews sang children's lullabies, finding comfort in the simple melodies of innocence. The Vorthok swarm's collective consciousness was completely unprepared for what it encountered. For millions of years, their intelligence had evolved to process efficiency, adaptation, and survival. They understood conquest, resource allocation, and strategic thinking, but they had never encountered a species that would willingly choose extinction for the sake of strangers. The cascade failure began in the swarm's central processing nodes. Their collective mind, faced with the complete, illogical nature of human sacrifice, began to overload. How could a species choose death over survival? How could beings sacrifice themselves for enemies who had rejected them? The questions created computational loops that spiraled out of control. Its analysis impossible. The swarm's central consciousness transmitted to its component units. Human behavior violates all survival protocols. Unable to process sacrifice without benefit. Unable to compute extinction by choice. The overload spread through the swarm's network like a virus. Processing nodes that had operated flawlessly for centuries began shutting down as they tried to understand the human's actions. Communication relays went silent. Coordination systems failed. The perfect mechanical unity that had made the swarm unstoppable began to collapse. One by one, human ships reached their targets. Each impact was a small sun blooming in the darkness. Fusion explosion that marked the end of a crew's journey and the beginning of the swarm's destruction. The alien observers wept as they watched an entire species choose to die rather than allow evil to triumph. The final human ship struck the swarm's primary command node, and the cascade failure became complete. The silence that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever experienced, or once the Vorthok swarm had moved with terrible purpose. Now only broken pieces drifted through the void. The mechanical nightmares that had consumed 17 star systems were nothing more than twisted metal and dark circuits, floating like ash after a great fire. The human fleet was gone. Every ship, every crew member, every brave soul who had volunteered for this impossible mission had given their lives in those final moments. The space around the Zilani homeworld was filled with debris and radiation signatures, the only remaining evidence of humanity's ultimate sacrifice. But from the wreckage came a single, weak signal. Escape pod, its hull scarred in its systems. Failing, drifted among the ruins of two civilizations. Inside, Admiral Jae-sung lay dying, his body broken by the forces that had torn his flagship apart. With his last breath, he activated the pod's emergency transmitter. "This is Admiral Jae-sung of the Human Defense Fleet." His voice crackled across the galaxy's communication networks. "The Vorthok swarm has been eliminated. The threat has ended." He paused, coughing up blood before continuing. "This is what happens when you corner the children of Earth. We don't just fight. We ensure the threat never rises again. Tell our families we kept our promise." The transmission grew weaker as the escape pod's power systems began to fail. "We were never the monsters you thought we were," Jae-sung whispered. "We were just a species that understood the price of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Remember us not as the violent Deathworlders you feared, but as the beings who chose to die so others could live." The pod's beacon faded into darkness, carrying the last human voices into the infinite void. Admiral Jae-sung's final words echoed across thousands of worlds. Reaching species that had once shunned humanity as too dangerous for civilized society, the aftermath was profound. The Galactic Council, meeting in emergency session, struggled to comprehend what had happened. The same species they had quarantined and rejected had sacrificed themselves completely to save strangers. The Zilani homeworld was safe, its billions of inhabitants alive because humans had chosen to die for them. Within days, the Council established the Kim Memorial Fleet, naming it after Admiral Jae-sung's family name. It would be a joint galactic force dedicated to protecting peaceful species from threats too great for any single civilization to handle. But everyone knew that no other species would ever be capable of what humanity had done. The few human survivors, those who had remained in the Sol system to maintain the colonies, suddenly found themselves treated very differently. Where once they had been feared and avoided, now they were approached with something approaching reverence. The aliens who had once called them monsters now recognized them as heroes. On Earth, memorial services were held for the fallen. Children who had never met their parents' heroes sang songs about the brave crews who had saved the galaxy. Artists created monuments to the sacrifice, while writers struggled to find words that could capture the magnitude of what had been lost and won. The galaxy learned a lesson that would echo through history. Humanity's true strength had never been their weapons or their tactics or their technology. It had been their willingness to sacrifice everything for those who couldn't save themselves. They had proven that sometimes the greatest victory requires the ultimate price in the end. The species that had been rejected as too violent for civilized society had shown the galaxy what true civilization really meant. They had demonstrated that strength without compassion was worthless, but compassion backed by the willingness to sacrifice everything was the most powerful force in the universe. The stars would remember their sacrifice forever,